should Joe Biden drop out of the presidential election? And while we're at it, are we reliving 1968? They say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And 2024 is doing a lot of rhyming with 1968. There are the obvious parallels. Protests on college campuses in 1968, campus protests in the exact same building 2024. Police forcibly removing and arresting students 1968. Police forcibly removing and arresting students on the exact same date 2024. There are calls for the sitting president to drop his bid for re-election.
Sure, all those things we need to do, child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our healthcare system.
Something that may not happen, probably won't happen, but did happen in 1968.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
What I'm trying to say is that the parallels are there. All of this makes you wonder, can the past help to predict the future? Because if so, the Democratic National Convention will be a mess. Maybe. Just like the 2024 DNC, the 1968 DNC took place in, guess where? Chicago. It's giving script, it's giving simulation, it's giving prank. Because the president, Lyndon B. Johnson, decided not to seek re-election, the 1968 Democratic National Convention was crazy. Candidates all across the political spectrum were jockeying for position.
Wisconsin is not recognized for that purpose.
Carl Albert.
Factions became violent. People were upset.
But even inside the convention hall, the virus of violence was pervasive.
Anti-war protesters clashed with police. There was a real-life riot, and the results of all of it were just awful. Richard Nixon wins the White House. He campaigns on restoring law and order, using images of young people protesting.
When the nation with the greatest tradition of the rule of law is plagued by unprecedented lawlessness, then it's time for new leadership for the United States of America.
And his presidency ushers in a new era, a new brand of conservatism. So in this video, ahead of the 2024 DNC, I want to understand how Americans can avoid the chaos of the 1968 DNC. After Joe Biden's less than exciting performance at the very first presidential debate of the cycle, some people are pushing for the nuclear option. And I have to say, I genuinely don't know if that's the right move, but history may be able to give us some help. With an anti-war protest movement likely to regain momentum ahead of the convention and the distant, and I do mean distant, prospect of the president stepping down, I think it makes sense to look back on yesteryear. I wasn't around in 1968, so I reached out to someone who was.
I actually was arrested for the first time in my life in January of 1968.
That's Juan Gonzalez. He's a journalist, activist, Chicagoan, and one of the leaders of the 1968 Columbia University campus protests. He gave me some really great insight into how the world felt in 1968 for him, and I imagine for many others living through those tumultuous times.
There was a feeling that the entire process of selecting the president had become undemocratic.
I learned a lot in this conversation, and if you stick around at the end, I'll share a few lessons from history that I think Democrats can implement to avoid another 1968 catastrophe. So with that, let's dig in. One of the first things I wanted to understand was how it felt living through that time. As one of the organizers behind the 1968 Columbia University campus protests, I wanted to ask Juan Gonzalez about the differences between those protests back then and the ones we've seen in 2024.
Well, I think people need to understand that there were some significant differences. Here in currently, the United States is funding and supporting a war that is involved in actually a genocidal war. Back in 1968, the United States was directly participating in the war in Vietnam that led to the deaths of over 2 million of Vietnamese throughout the period of the entire war. People forget, in the week after Martin Luther King was assassinated, there were uprisings and civil disorders in over 100 cities in the United States.
I think it's kind of easy to get caught up in the unprecedented times that we're living in now and never realize that every generation before us lived through unprecedented times too.
Not Ferguson or LA after Rodney King or Baltimore. There was actually 100 cities in 1 week. Basically, business as usual in the entire country ended. All sports contests were called off. There were pictures of thousands and thousands of whites lining up in long lines to buy guns because they thought that, in essence, a civil war was about to happen. So if you were a senior in college in America in 1968, as I was, the last thing on your mind was, what kind of job am I going to get when I graduate?
I've read the history of events like this in books that lay out the facts and dates, but there are feelings, vibes that just can't be captured in words on paper. They have to be retold through personal narrative.
What you were really seeing was the entire country being torn apart, both by the Vietnam War and the thousands of bodies coming back of American soldiers who have been killed, as well as by the insurrections in the African-American community. So I think that was the context that caused so many young people to rise up.
What lessons should politicians and leaders learn from 68 going into this fall, this election, and this year?
Yeah, well, that's a very important question because I live in Chicago now, and I moved here a couple of years ago. And I was also in Chicago for the Democratic Convention because I joined SDS after the strike.
The chaos of the 1968 Chicago DNC wasn't entirely the Democratic Party's fault. It wasn't even fully Lyndon Johnson's fault for stepping down. There were a few things at play.
President Johnson announces that he is not going to run for re-election, that he has been so disheartened by his failures in the Vietnam War and the rise of Eugene McCarthy as an anti-war candidate, that he announces he will not run for re-election, which threw the entire Democratic Party nomination into chaos. And led to the rise of Bobby Kennedy.
Anti-Vietnam War sentiments had been growing, with Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy representing the primary faces of that political movement.
How many men must die to justify some 23,000 Americans and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, North and South?
When Lyndon Johnson ended his bid for re-election, many assumed that one of those two individuals would get the nomination. But then tragedy strikes. Bobby Kennedy gets assassinated.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible? Is that possible?
Bobby Kennedy gets assassinated in June, and he was the second anti-war candidate after McCarthy, but he had much more of the mainstream of the Democratic Party behind him. So it was likely that Bobby Kennedy would have gotten the nomination had he not been assassinated. The Democratic Convention was essentially a convention with no leading candidate.
This bit of chaos wasn't avoidable. It's the very definition of the unpredictability of life. But some of the chaos was avoidable. For starters, Democrats didn't really have a democratic process designed for choosing their candidate. So they chose LBJ's vice president, a very party politics kind of move.
Hubert Humphrey was chosen by the party to become the candidate. So there was a feeling that the entire process of selecting the president had become undemocratic.
And that's the first lesson that I think history is trying to teach party leaders today. Make sure the process is transparent and democratic. If in the very unlikely scenario that Joe Biden isn't the party's nominee, party leaders will have to go above and beyond to make sure the public knows how a new candidate is being chosen. Truthfully, the most obvious way to do that is to do everything possible to make sure Joe Biden is the party's nominee. America has a transparent and democratic process for choosing party nominees. It's called the primaries. And despite the sucky two-party system we're kind of stuck in, despite President Biden's recent challenges, he won the Democratic Party's primaries handily in the first part of this year.
I don't walk as easy as I used to. I don't speak as smoothly as I used to. I don't debate as well as I used to. But I know what I do know. I know how to tell the truth. I know how to get things done. And I know, like millions of Americans know, when you get knocked down, you get back up.
Another important factor in 1968 was Chicago's leadership.
There was a mayor at the time, Richard Daley, who was determined to crush any dissent and who basically put out the order to police, shoot any looter on sight. The reports of the Chicago Democratic Convention conflict concluded there had been a police riot. I mean, Chicago was the first time I was ever shot at by police. I mean, literally, we were in protest in the street and you could hear bullets whizzing over our heads as police tried to beat back the protesters.
This is a huge difference between the DNC of 1968 and the DNC of 2024. Chicago has a progressive mayor in Brandon Johnson. He is a former activist and protester himself, which seems like a good thing to me.
You know, the city of Chicago has a long history in demonstrations as well as protests, right? And if there was any mayor that would understand, the value of protests and demonstrations, it's certainly me. I've been a part of demonstrations and protests challenging the government to fight on behalf of the people of not just this city, but the country.
But some folks are concerned that he may not be tough enough on those looking to cause trouble.
And I'm very much confident that we're going to have a peaceful, safe, energetic, vibrant convention that's going to propel President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris back to the White House to continue to serve people of this country.
Johnson is committed to ensuring the safety of the DNC and its participants while also respecting protesters' right to protest, which is a tricky balance. And I think history's second lesson is to do everything possible to make sure that balance is maintained. Respect the enormity of the task, one that I do not envy. Train your officers like crazy. Create good infrastructure for positive outcomes. Designate leaders to make sure that things don't get out of hand. And for Gonzalez, that goes for protesters as well.
I do think it's going to be necessary for the young people who come to Chicago, and they undoubtedly will, to think not just for the moment of what kind of protest they're going to have in Chicago, but what will be the message sent to the rest of the nation. You do not want a situation where the right wing then utilizes chaos on the streets of Chicago as Richard Nixon did in his election bid in 1968, because that's when Nixon began his law and order campaign. We got to bring law and order back to the streets of America, and he was able to hoodwink many of the American people in order to be able to defeat Hubert Humphrey.
I think what Gonzalez is saying here gets to the third lesson from history. The bigger picture matters. Favorability polls reveal a hard truth for America. Neither Donald Trump or Joe Biden are particularly popular. Many of President Biden's policies are popular, though he doesn't get the credit he deserves for them. But the reality is that most Americans would rather some other candidate. Yet, one of those two candidates will almost certainly be our next president. And they will bring cabinet members, secretaries, department directors, judges, Supreme Court justices, and so much more with them. Those leaders will be tasked with making frontline decisions on tax policies, housing and urban development, climate legislation, education, infrastructure decisions, and a host of other programs that actually have real-world implications for the day-to-day lives of the American people. Spinning up the wheels of a brokered convention sent the 1968 Democratic Party into chaos. Democrats did not choose to nominate the more popular anti-war candidate, choosing Hubert Humphrey instead, which further fractured an already divided party, obscured the bigger picture, and lost them that election at a really critical moment of potential progress. They say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And if that's true, I don't know if America is ready to hear that song again. Okay, I think I'm gonna call it there. Thank you so much for watching, and of course for subscribing. I'd love to know what you're thinking about American politics right now. That is a crazy thing to ask for, because there are a lot of things going on in American politics. So be sure to drop your thoughts down in the comments. I'll be down there checking out what you have to say. Of course, if you would, consider subscribing, drop a like. Those things really do make a difference. Of course, a huge thanks to Juan Gonzalez for taking some time to talk to me and dropping so much knowledge. And as always, I'm grateful that you're here, my friends. Until next time, peace.